Good evening. Welcome to UPARS Los Angeles. My name is Steve Murillo. I am the director of UPARS LA. This is May 2019. We have an old friend with us. Well, he's not old, he's young, but he's here with us. He's a friend. His name is Preston Dennett. And Preston Dennett began investigating UFOs and the paranormal in 1986 when he discovered that his family, friends, and coworkers were having dramatic, unexplained encounters. Since then, he has interviewed hundreds of witnesses and investigated a wide variety of paranormal phenomena. He is trained as a field investigator for MUFON Network, still going strong. He's a ghost hunter, a paranormal researcher, and the author of more than 20 books and over 100 articles on UFOs and the paranormal. Preston's brought many of those books here to share with you guys, so go check it out. His articles have appeared in numerous magazines, including Fate, Atlantis Rising, the MUFON UFO Journal, Nexus, Paranormal Magazine, the UFO Magazine, Mysteries Magazine, Ufologist, and others. His writing has been translated into several different languages, including German, French, Portuguese, Russian, Icelandic, and Sumerian. Yeah. He's appeared on numerous radio and television programs, including Fade to Black with Jimmy Church, Midnight in the Desert with Art Bell, Coast to Coast, and also the History Channel's Deep Sea UFOs and UFO Hunters. His research has been presented in the LA Times, the LA Daily News, Dallas Morning News, and other newspapers. He has taught classes on various paranormal subjects and lectures all across the United States. He currently resides here. He's local. He's a local boy. Put your hands together and give it up for Preston Dennett.
I'm super excited to speak with you guys tonight. I want to thank you very much for coming to hear me speak. I've got an exciting presentation, which I think you're really going to enjoy, with about 60 slides, photographs, drawings, and some really interesting videos that I hope to play. And let's just dive right into it. Many of you probably already know how I became involved in UFO research, so I'll go over it just a little briefly. I found out in 1986, after hearing a report on the news about a pilot who saw a UFO, that many members of my family were having encounters. Hit me like a ton of bricks. It was not good news for me. I was very skeptical, and it got me very interested in this subject. And I started interviewing people, writing about it. I joined all the UFO groups, and kind of never looked back. Interestingly, my very first humanoid case was someone in my family who saw ETs in front of Stagg Street Elementary School. And that really piqued my interest. It was my first schoolyard UFO case, which is the subject of what I'm going to be talking about tonight. And that's sort of really got me interested in it. I've always been keeping an eye out for cases like that, and they have turned up over the years. There's probably 4 or 5 really famous schoolyard UFO cases, is what I call them. And the most well-known by far is probably one you've heard of, the Ruwa, Zimbabwe case. How many of you have heard of the Ariel School encounter? All right, quite a number of you, not everyone. That occurred in 1994 in Ruwa, Zimbabwe, and involved a landing and humanoids at an elementary school. Prior to that, there's actually a long history of UFOs targeting schools. In 2016, Dr. Roger Stankovic, the National Director of MUFON Australia, posed this question on Facebook. He said, "Aliens on the playground? Over the past 50 years, UFOs have appeared in broad daylight sporadically at various school grounds over 4 continents around the world." And he lists the top 4 sightings. One is the Ruwa, Zimbabwe case. Another is the Westall case in Melbourne, Australia, in which a UFO landed outside of a high school. There's another very famous case which occurred in 1977 in Wales at the Broadhaven Primary School. And then there's another case which occurred in Opelika, Florida. The Crestview Elementary School also experienced a UFO landing right there at the school. And to those 4 cases, I would add definitely the Hillsdale, Michigan case in 1966, in which a UFO landed outside of a college in Hillsdale, Michigan. So these are 4 or 5 really well-known cases. And after hearing about the Opalaka case, I thought, oh my gosh, schools are being targeted by UFOs. Schools are what I would call a UFO attractor. I've written about these sort of things in some of my other books, the Not From Here series, areas that attract UFOs, places like graveyards or Air Force bases or rocket launches, mines, our metal mines. These sort of things have a disproportionately high number of UFO encounters, and that's certainly true with schools. And this is no news to UFO investigators. Way back in 1966, following the Dexter, Michigan, the Hillsdale sightings, Jim and Coral Lorenzen, who were pioneers of APRO, they realized that after the Michigan case that they had amassed a number of cases where schools were targeted. And Raymond Fowler, who's probably best known for investigating the Andreasen affair, Betty Andreasen in Massachusetts, he also found some really incredible school encounters, particularly the one at Beverly High School in Massachusetts. And following that, he started reviewing his cases and realized that the last 20 cases he had, 8 involved schools that were targeted. So this is definitely a thing. UFOs are targeting our schools. And as I was reviewing and collecting these cases, I thought, there's a few, 4 or 5 really well-known ones. I have now got at least 40 or 50 of these types of cases. And it's really remarkable because these cases have a feature that is kind of much different than your average sighting. And by that I mean the average sighting I would describe as a brief encounter of an anomalous light flying overhead at night, perhaps at a pretty high altitude. That's kind of the encounter I hear from most people. Whereas schoolyard encounters have several really major fundamental differences from your average encounter. And the first difference, I think, is that most schoolyard encounters occur during the day. Daylight encounters are relatively rare, but when it comes to schoolyard encounters, it's pretty much the norm. Following that is they last a long time. The average UFO sighting is maybe a couple of seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes. There's not a whole lot of super long encounters. When it comes to the schoolyard encounters, generally they last at least 5 minutes, 10 minutes, half an hour, 3 hours. In several cases, they occur over a period of days. So these are prolonged and extensive encounters in a number of ways. Another difference is most UFOs are seen at very high altitudes. Not so with schoolyard encounters. They come down right over these schools to a level of 3,000 feet would be high. Much more common it would be like 1,000 feet, 500 feet, 100 feet, in a few cases 30 feet over these schools, 10 feet, real close to these schools. And these are not what I would call flyovers either, which did happen at some schools, but I discarded those. These are cases in which the schools are specifically targeted. UFOs come swooping down to the sky, aiming for the school, and that's where they stop. And I think that will become more obvious as I start to go into the cases. So yeah, there's a lot of really interesting differences. A lot of these cases involve landings, where these objects actually land right there next to the school or on the playground itself. A number of these cases also involve humanoids, a disproportionately large number. So these are some really important and fundamental differences. Another thing I noticed is that many of these encounters are so extensive that they generate a government or military response. That's certainly not unusual. Also not unusual is that they generate a lot of publicity, and these encounters are published in local newspapers at the least, often receiving national or international headlines. So these are some patterns that pretty much exhibited themselves in the vast majority of the cases of schoolyard encounters. So as we go through them, just keep in mind of these types of patterns. So let's just dive right into it because I got a lot of stuff I want to show you guys tonight. I found some really early cases. There was one from like 1835 over a college of this weird light. But really, most of the cases didn't begin until the modern age of UFOs after 1947. The earliest case I could really find that was substantial occurred in 1952 at this school, the Elder Park Primary School, and this is in Glasgow, Scotland. And it was during the summer, it was around 4 p.m., school had just let out, and one of the witnesses, her name is Joan Torrance, she's 13 years old, was leaving the school. Behind her was one of her teachers, there was the janitor, all her friends, they were walking across the playground here in front of the school when everyone started screaming. There was well over 100 people there, and they were screaming and pointing up at the top of the building here, and you can see these little steeples. There was this giant object hovering about 100 feet over the steeple. It was perfectly still, it was tilted slightly at an angle, and it was rotating, and it was about 30, 40 feet across and shaped like a sombrero and metallic, just sitting there. The witness was asked, "How long did you see it?" She says, "Well, you know, I lost track of time. It was as if time stood still." She's not sure how long she saw it, which is, a significant factor when it comes to UFO encounters for sure. No indication of any abductions. After a few moments, we're not sure how long, suddenly, she says, it was like a switch was turned. This thing started whining really loudly, lifted up, and moved off pretty swiftly away from the school and over the town of Glasgow. All the children, of course, went home and told their parents. Many of them were not believed until the next morning when newspapers broke this story. It turned out this UFO had gone straight over Glasgow, and a lot of people saw it. So this is sort of the first real schoolyard encounter that I could find. And following this, boy, they occurred pretty darn regularly. Another case occurred 2 years later, on October 22nd in 1954, over Jerome Elementary School in Marysville, Ohio. It's a very interesting case. 50 children, very young children, were on the playground. Oh, this is another thing I wanted to mention too, going back a little bit in terms of the differences between a normal encounter and a schoolyard encounter. With schoolyard encounters, we have 50 witnesses on the average, 100, 200 in some cases, or more. So that's very unusual. Also unusual is the fact that most of the witnesses are children. Now, children could be considered, imaginative and not having a real concept of perhaps what UFOs might be, which could go either way. I mean, you could say that makes them bad witnesses. I think it makes them good witnesses, actually, because their minds are not polluted. They have no prejudiced ideas about what UFOs are. They just tell it like they see it. And if you think, well, kids aren't reliable, the vast majority of schoolyard encounters have teachers who are seeing this as well, who are highly educated people. So this is an important difference, I think, from a lot of other normal encounters. So here we are at Jerome Elementary School in Ohio in 1954, and there's 40, 50 school children, elementary school age, on the playground, and suddenly they see this object swoop down out of the sky and come right over the school about 1,000 feet up. It was metallic, it was oval or football shaped. It was very bright, and it had lights or windows around it. They weren't sure which because it was so darn bright. And after hovering a bit, this thing starts circling around the school over and over and over. After about 5 minutes, someone had the presence of mind to call in the teachers. And they shouted out to Mr. Warwick, was one of their teachers, and he comes running out and sees this thing and is shocked. He later told reporters, yeah, it was metallic. I don't know what it was. It was glinting there in the sun. It wasn't that high up. It had come lower and lower. And he's looking at it, trying to figure out what it is, and realizes this is a genuine UFO, and runs back inside to call some more teachers. And another teacher comes running out, Miss Dimmick, and she runs out and looks up, and the thing is gone. It darts away at that exact moment. But she sees something else. Everyone does. They're all looking up, and when suddenly this entire sky fills with these little tiny white particles like snow. It was really beautiful. It covered the entire sky. It's what's actually known as angel hair. It's sort of this cotton candy, spiderweb-like substance. This is a very early case involving angel hair, and there was a lot of it. It fell for the next 45 minutes, completely coating the entire playground, the entire school, and all the school grounds around it. A bunch of children scooped it up and brought it to the teachers, and they're handling it. It disintegrates very quickly, but there was so much of it that it was staying around for quite some time. Ms. Dimmick and Mr. Warwick both scooped it up and were handling it and rolling it up into little balls, which became sort of like these gelatinous sort of globs that slowly dissolved and disappeared. And after they did that, both of them realized their hands were now green, had these green stains on them, which really concerned Ms. Dimmick, and she rushes to go wash it off. But the other guy, Mr. Warwick's like, you know what, I'm going to leave it on, see what happens. And nothing really happened. His hands became cold and clammy, and after a while, his hands felt normal and the green stains disappeared, apparently just evaporating off. And following this incident, they were leaving the school, and they found out that the angel hair was spread over a 3-mile range surrounding the school. It was so thick it was draping over trees, over cars, over telephone wires, to the point where it created an actual corridor over the road that they were in, like, a covered hallway, down the road that they were driving. So it was an enormous amount of angel hair and a really remarkable schoolyard case. Now, I did mention this case earlier, so I won't get too far into it. This occurred on April 29th, 1964. This is Sharon Stoll, who was at the Lowell Elementary School in Albuquerque, New Mexico, when a UFO came swooping down over the playground. She's apparently the only one who saw it, but it struck her with a beam of light, which caused real problems. She had to be rushed to the hospital. She was having vision problems. She was diagnosed with second-degree burns, and in the days and weeks following this incident, she experienced accelerated growth to the point where she grew over a half foot over a period of weeks and became very mature and started talking about all these really mature concepts and was doing things normally that adults would do. It's a pretty controversial case. The Air Force did investigate it, but labeled it a hoax. And Jim and Cora Lorenzen, who were investigating it, later stopped because the mother, Mrs. Stoll, was demanding money for having her story told. I think it's a legitimate case, though, and really fits right in with these schoolyard cases. All right, now I want to get to one of the granddaddy of the cases, the Hillsdale, Michigan case, which occurred on March 21st, 1966, over Hillsdale College in Michigan. And it started when a bunch of the ladies in the girls' dorm, the females' dorm room, noticed some lights outside of the school, in front of the school, in this very swampy field area. And they screamed. There was 10 of them, and suddenly a bunch of people rushed to the windows. People started rushing outside because this object was about 300 feet away, was very large. One of the first witnesses was Barbara Cohn, and she says, and I'm quoting, "There was a glow around it, and the lights appeared to be pulsating. The object seemed to move up and then to the right and left very slightly. And following that, it began to move unpredictably, darting around. At some point, it appeared to be landing." Teresa, another witness, said, "It was an evening. We were all studying for midterms. A student in the room that faced the arboretum called to us to her window to see a huge disc hovering over the tops of the trees. It was metallic, gold, and it had a red-orange light in the center and 2 blue-white lights on the side. It was perhaps 75 feet across and within 100 yards of us. As we watched it move forward and backward and eventually sideways, away from us, it then landed in a grassy clearing." I know a lot of people are familiar with the Hillsdale, Michigan case, but what a lot of people don't know is this thing actually landed there right in front of the school. And when that happened, a bunch of the people in the boys' dorm started running out in the field towards it. It took off upwards again. At this point, the police were called, and they also saw this object. So it was viewed by about 87 students is the number, and a bunch of school faculty. It's a really remarkable case. And following the case, actually, Certainly the police were informed, and so was Project Blue Book. J. Allen Hynek was a part of the Blue Book back then. He was the astronomical consultant. He was called to investigate, and didn't really have a chance to investigate before they called a press conference. And during this press conference, which was kind of a zoo, he was asked what he thought these things were. And he started listing several theories of what it might be, one of which he speculated could be swamp gas. And this is what the newspapers seized upon and basically said Air Force identifies the UFO as swamp gas, which isn't what he said. And he became pretty upset about it. It was a low point in his career, he said, and a complete circus. He ended up leaving Project Blue Book shortly afterwards, but it caused a huge uproar. At the time, President Ford, he wasn't president, he was a state representative, he called for an investigation, and this eventually did lead to a congressional investigation, in part because of this, the first congressional investigation on UFOs.
Frank Manner's UFO remained over his swamp more than 4 hours. His children saw it, his in-laws saw it, residents of the area saw it, the police saw it. No one photographed it, but Sergeant Newell Schneider of the Sheriff's Office remembered it well enough to draw it.
No, it moved very rapidly at any speed, or rather any direction it wanted to go. Why it could change and go to the right or the left or go crossways without hesitating a bit.
What do you think it was?
Well, if they call it a flying saucer, that's what it is.
40 miles away, another swampland and another UFO sighting. This is Hillsdale, and the girls at Hillsdale College had a night to remember.
Well, when I was looking out the window with the binoculars, I guess it was about 12, I saw it, and I saw 2 red lights, and I saw what looked to be shaped like a pie. I could just see the front of it, and I just saw the round front, and I could see the lights on either side. And then the red light was sort of casting a glow over the whole thing, so it looked like a round disc.
At first, when I'd heard the other girls talk about it, I believed them, yet I couldn't really make myself comprehend it because I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But then when I saw it, I just was fascinated. I wasn't afraid. I just wanted to stay there and keep my eyes glued to it. I couldn't leave.
I know I saw it, but, and I know myself I saw it, but I believe I saw it, but I can't fathom it because it seems so unreal.
William Van Horn, Hillsdale's undertaker and civil defense director, also spotted the UFO and was out with his Geiger counter next day, checking a mysterious perfect circle where the UFO had been seen. Van Horn did not find any radioactivity here, but this did not shake his certainty that he had seen a hovering vehicle with 2 lights. Many people asked him why he did not go right up to the UFO in the dark.
I'd much rather be a live coward than a dead hero. And with the area of uncertainty that we have here, how do I know but what maybe there's a current, a little electrical charge which is being radiated by one of these vehicles which would electrocute you if you got within a certain area of it. There was no sound whatsoever. I could not hear a bit of sound.
The Air Force sent its chief scientific consultant on UFOs, Professor J. Allen Hynek, to check the Michigan sightings. Dr. Hynek agreed that the good citizens of Michigan had seen something in the marshlands. He thought they had seen marsh gas. Frank Manner, the Michigan farmer who had brought in the first report, was caught in the middle. He was mad.
Well, you can look at here, look, beer bottles thrown.
All right, I'm going to stop it there because I've got a lot of slides I want to play for you guys, so let me just get this back to normal. So yeah, that's the Hillsdale, Michigan one, the really first schoolyard encounter that got a lot of publicity. But following that, there were some really amazing encounters. And in fact, it was 2 weeks and 2 days after that one of the biggest schoolyard encounters in the history of our planet occurred. And this is at Westall High School in Melbourne, Australia, on April 6, 1966. This bunch of people were on the playground, an estimated 200, 300 children and several teachers, when a UFO showed up and came swooping down very low over the playground, went just beyond it and started to hover over this grove of trees and come in for a landing. A lot of people saw it. It caused instant chaos and pandemonium. Among the first to actually run up to it was Terry Peck. And she was out, well, here's what she says. We were out playing sports on the oval. One of the kids yelled out, look up in the sky, it's flying saucers. And I remember we all looked up, and it really was a flying saucer. It was a round silver disc, and it seemed to be very low over the school. And I remember kids screaming and running inside. There was a lot of witnesses. These are some of the witnesses who, as adults, still remember the incident. Joy Clark here on your left was there, and she said, this boy came running in, and he said, Mr. Greenwood, there's these things in the sky. He was hysterical. He leaned up against the sliding door screaming, there's a flying saucer in the oval. And of course, everybody started to head toward the door, and the teacher said, sit down. A few minutes later, the bell went off, and everyone just took off into the oval in time to see it taking off from the oval. It was probably 50 feet or more at that stage. One of the witnesses earlier, who I mentioned, Terry Peck, she actually ran right up to it with a group of other girls. When she got there, she was one of the first people there. There was some boys there walking around it. One was touching it. And her friend Tanya actually arrived there first and fainted dead away. There were several children who were crying and screaming and freaking out. Teachers were completely freaking out because these kids were just pouring out of the school in two lines out of the doors and rushing up to the fence to see this thing and hopping over the fence to try and get to it. And several did get to it. And Terry Peck actually watched this thing rise up, turn sideways, and take off. Now, there were a number of planes in the sky, 4 or 5 small planes, which apparently followed this thing to the school and were trying to get close to it. Each time they did, this thing would just dart around them and leave them as if they were still in the sky. So a lot of people saw this thing. Kevin Hurley, he saw it. He saw also the landing traces this thing left. Here's a drawing from one of the witnesses. This object radiated heat as you got close to it. This, I'm not sure that this is an actual photograph of the object, but it's widely believed to be if you go on the internet. Can't verify that, but it certainly does match some of the descriptions that people have put forth. This is the landing trace it did leave in the grove of trees. So this was seen by almost all the school. Following this incident, immediately following it, the police were called, and they arrived. Shortly later, the press arrived, reporters from various newspapers, literally within about 15 or 20 minutes. Some of the students, including Joy Clark, were being interviewed by the press when the Australian Army showed up in jeeps with soldiers wearing camouflage and shut down the interview immediately, told the kids not to talk about it, marched through the school, told the teachers not to talk about it, had the teachers go through the hallways, warning students not to talk. They held a special assembly, and they brought kids into the office separately, had them describe what they saw, and said that they didn't see what they thought they saw. It must have been helicopters or a weather balloon, which the kids denied, and they were told not to talk about it. They held a special assembly that day, and were basically told that what you saw, you didn't see what you think you saw, and that you were just hysterical, and forget about it. Nothing happened. This incident was pretty effectively covered up. There were a few articles that did come out, but no one talked about it for years and years afterwards. And now, of course, it's a huge case. It's considered Australia's most widely viewed UFO event in the history of that country. So it's really a remarkable case. Recently, Keith Basterfield, an Australian researcher, says he thinks it was probably a weather balloon, and this is something that seriously offended a lot of the witnesses. And I don't think it's a reasonable explanation. I mean, it certainly doesn't account for the landing traces or how this thing was able to outmaneuver planes or a number of other details. So yeah, not a weather balloon. So that was an amazing case, and not the only one. Shortly following that case, like a month later, on April 22nd, 1966, there was a huge schoolyard encounter in Beverly, Massachusetts. This was investigated by Raymond Fowler, a very well-known investigator. And it all began when this 13-year-old girl, Nancy Modugno, looked out her bedroom window. She lived right next to Beverly High School, and saw what she thought was a car driving down the street, but it wasn't a car. It was a glowing football-shaped object floating about 5 feet over the road. It had red lights on top, white lights around the perimeter, no windows that she could see, and was just moving leisurely along, heading towards Beverly High School. And she screams, goes running downstairs, and tells her dad, and he's not understanding what she's saying. When the mom, who was visiting the neighbors next door, she comes rushing in with the neighbors, and they're like, what's wrong, what's wrong? And she's like, it's a UFO. It just drove by. It's right over there. And she's like, no one believed her. But they said, I'll tell you what. Her mother and her two friends decided, we will go outside and look. And so they looked outside, and when Nancy first ran down the stairs, she saw this thing actually landing in the field in front of Beverly High School. When her parents, her mom and her friends, got outside, they didn't see it, but they walked down the street and over the hill to where the high school was and looked up and saw 3 flying saucers. And two were pretty high up there, one was much lower, and each of them were circling and hovering and circling. They were bright, oval-shaped objects, and they were watching and thinking, oh my gosh, these are not normal, when one of the witnesses reaches up and waves at one of them. And at that point, it stopped circling and comes swooping down right towards them very quickly. It startled them so badly that 2 of them turned to run. One did run, the other didn't, because Brenda, the one who's watching it, said, stop, it's already right over our head. And the second one who was about to run looked up, and it was about 20 feet up, and that was enough. She ran. So there's 2 women ran, and 1 stayed there. And when they realized their friend was not running, they turned around and looked. And she was now cowering on the ground, screaming with her hands over her head like this, because this object was 10 feet over her head. Scared her very badly. She involuntarily urinated. It was an extremely frightening experience. And they're like, run, 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 run. And finally she listened and she ran. And all 3 women ran down the street back into the house. Their daughter Nancy is saying, did you see it? Did you see it? And they said, call the police right now. And so they did. They called the police, and then they gathered the entire household and all the neighbors, and a group of about 10 people, including Nancy, who first saw it, walked back to the high school, and these objects were still there. Mind you, there was a basketball game going on at the time in the building. So there was a lot of people in the school who weren't seeing this and had no idea that one of these objects was coming lower and lower and lower over the school, and it stopped and hovered about 30 feet above the main building. And that's when the police showed up and saw the people standing there, and they're like, all right, who called about the plane? And they're like joking, like, we did, and it's right there. And the police officers saw it, got really shooken up, jumped out of their car, at which point this thing slowly lifted up and took off. So Raymond Fowler investigated this and did some research, found that there was a lot of other people who saw it in the area at that time, and following this incident, this thing took off and went north. It went straight to another college nearby, to Wenham College, came barreling down and hovered over the oval there in front of the quadrangle, and scared the living daylights out of the people there who saw this thing come at about 100 feet altitude, stop, make a right degree turn, and dart off into the sky and up and gone. So again, clearly targeting the school. A lot of other cases I could talk about. One case involving a series of sightings over Hotchkiss School, where they actually photographed this thing on March 9th, 1966. The Sacred Heart Elementary School in Moline, Illinois was targeted. There was 40 students and a police officer and 2 nuns who saw this thing. The police officer was actually able to capture some film of this object on his 8mm camera, which he carried around for his job. All right, I want to play a little video. Let's see if I can get this done in a more... This is a 2-minute video, which...
it remains one of Australia's most enduring mysteries and one of the world's most baffling UFO cases. And for the first time, a group of witnesses have come together to shed light on what really happened here in Westall in 1966.
Authorities claimed it was a weather balloon, but 5 decades on, these witnesses aren't so sure.
I stood there absolutely transfixed and saw the most amazing thing I've ever seen in my life. And it took a while for me to sort of comprehend what I was actually looking at, because I'd never seen anything like that before.
There was 3. The one that was closer was just in the sky, just sitting there. And then it went down, came up, and then banked on its side and took off really, really fast.
It was moving away, so it had lifted off with the oval, okay, and it was moving away from us, and we just were gobsmacked, started chasing it, and my girlfriend and I sat on the fence, climbed up the fence and just sat there and cried. We thought it was the end of the world.
When I came down into the paddock where the kids had seen this thing land, the paddock grass was about knee high, and as I walked through with pushing my bike with my uncle, I saw a group of about 20 people all huddled around looking at the ground, all looking at a circle, perfect circle. It was probably about 4 or 5 metres in diameter. The edge of the circle was perfectly formed. It wasn't as if you could, cows or any other animals or even the kids had come in and just rolled around. It was too perfect.
I mean, I know what I saw, and in fact, I don't expect them to believe me, because when it happened, I didn't believe what I was seeing, because it wasn't possible. What I was seeing wasn't possible.
So yeah, the Westall incident was huge, and the Beverly High School incident happened directly after that. And the next incident I want to talk about occurred literally 1 year to the day after the Westall incident, and this is also one of the 4 most famous schoolyard UFO encounters, which occurred at Crestview Elementary School in Opelika, Florida. And it began on April 6th when Mr. Apfall, one of the teachers, was herding all the students back into the school after recess and gotten pretty much all of them except for 6 of the kids back in when one of the boys tugs on his arm and is like, "What's that up there in the sky?" And he looks up and he sees this metallic disc. And they're all looking at he and the 6 students when it just flits away. He's like, "I don't know what that was." And they went back inside. And it was the next day, actually, when everything just went crazy. People were in school when suddenly someone shouts out, "There are flying saucers outside." And they go rushing out, and sure enough, there's not 1, not 2, but 4 different objects hovering outside of the school. And one's very large, 2 are much smaller, and one of them looks like it's coming in for a landing. These were young elementary school kids, 10, 11, 12 years old. And it began when everyone rushed to the fence there on the north end of the school and saw these 4 objects. Each were lit up on the end with a white light. And one object appeared to be playing cat and mouse games with this plane that was also circling the area. And a 3rd object came in for a landing in the grove of trees behind the school. This is another pattern I kept seeing. When these objects would land, they'd always land within a grove of trees. And that's what happened here. Jimmy Hummel, he was 11 years old. He saw the craft coming in for a landing, and he had the impression that it was actually trying to hide within the trees. Joe Kornblit, age 11, he heard all the ruckus outside, and he describes what he saw as a white, silvery, oval-shaped object about the size of a car hovering directly above the trees. He watched it shrink down, disappear, and it reappeared in another place. There was brothers and sisters who were watching this, Linda and John McCleary, both of whom observed it, and described it as sort of a hubcap-shaped thing. Her brother John said that there were at least 4 of these objects all milling around the trees and performing all these incredible maneuvers. One teacher, student, David Bonefee, he was in 5th grade, and he says, our teacher only let us look for a moment, so I saw the oval-shaped craft, but I had to sit down, so I did not see the cigar-shaped UFOs. But he lives near the school, and he found out his parents saw these objects at the same time. There's some controversy surrounding exactly what happened, because at this point the military showed up and began walking through the school. They closed the school down and sent people home early. And as some of these students were marching out of the school, these objects were still in the sky. And parents were very upset. They wanted to know why their kids were being sent home, and they kept calling the school. And the teachers weren't supposed to say anything. They were told not to talk about it. But they did. They're like, well, something landed. You didn't hear it from me. But something landed next to the school. And at this time, there was actually a huge wave of sightings going on in the area. There was a lot of witnesses a few days prior to this. So a lot of people saw this. Another witness, Steve, he recalls the incident as well. And he says he doesn't remember seeing the UFOs, actually. It's a weird blank in his mind. But he does remember the school closing down and the military there. Everyone who was there does remember the military. These objects were completely silent and darted around very quickly at times. And Mr. Apfel, he saw it again, and when it came back later in the day, these objects were staying there for quite a while. He closed the blinds, wouldn't let anyone go out. He didn't want to see it anymore. The headmaster was pretty upset too. He didn't want to talk about it. So there was about 200, 300 people who saw this thing as it actually went and landed there in the pine trees. Here's a drawing from one of the students. The top drawing is the teacher, actually, and the bottom drawing is from one of the students, who actually, I think, did a better drawing than the teacher, which I find interesting. But yeah, several teachers saw this. They went over and saw landing traces as well. When the school day ended, some kids tried to run over there and look at the landing traces, but by then the military had cordoned it off. And apparently the object was still there because they had binoculars out and they were looking at it, but they weren't venturing out into the field, and they were not letting anyone else go there. Now that was on a Friday. So this UFO came on a Thursday, it came on a Friday. Well, it came back on Saturday as well. Over 40 adult witnesses saw this thing hovering in the same grove of trees. And of course, the military did interview a lot of the witnesses at the school, including children and teachers, and didn't specifically necessarily tell them that they couldn't talk about it, but told them that what they saw were, in fact, helicopters. Now here's a map of the school. It turns out that Opalaka School is about 4 or 5 miles away from an airport, which isn't that far, but it's not super close either. And these students described something that was much closer than the airport, and clearly not a plane. And the teachers, Mr. Apfel, said flat out, he told reporters, no, it was a flying saucer. It wasn't a plane, it wasn't a helicopter, it wasn't a balloon, it wasn't anything like this. Following the incident, the landing traces were actually burned over. In the Westall incident, they took photographs. Those film from the photographs was taken by the military. So that was more effectively covered up than this one, which did generate a lot of publicity and articles about the event. So yeah, that's the Crestview Elementary School encounter in Opalaka, Florida. It's a pretty remarkable case, and there were no humanoids in that one. But following these incidents, humanoids started to appear more often. I don't know if it's because these were early cases that we don't see humanoids, but following this, we started to see them. So here's another newspaper article from the Opalaka case. And now I want to talk a little bit about what happened at Spring Creek Elementary School in 1967 in Dallas, Texas. This is an interesting case because this UFO showed up over the playground. A bunch of kids saw it, and it released all these silver discs, which spun around and went across the street and spun around and then went back into the disc, and it took off. And the thing is, only one kid remembers this, and he was going through the school a couple years later, actually, and asking if anyone remembered this incident. And only one person did. Another kid, and he remembered it slightly differently. He thought at first it was a crop dusting plane, and that it came very low over the school. They all thought it was a crop dusting plane at first, but it had no wings, it had no tail, and it was metallic. And instead of silver discs, he remembered this disc releasing red pellets, which rained down over the school. And that's all he really remembers, but they both think it's the same incident. So apparently it was covered up by the ETs, who no one remembered it, but two people. Where it was actually viewed by quite a number of people who they remember people being there and specifically asked them, and these kids did not remember it. A very strange encounter occurred in Peebles Elementary School in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in May 1967. And when the janitor waved her over and said, "I want to show you something," and took her into the basement where she saw a gray alien who started to speak to her telepathically. She looked over at her friend. Her friend was now passed out, unconscious, and she wasn't. And this ET started to speak to her. It said, "We are here to remind you who you are." And she does not know what that means. She doesn't to this day, but she really wants to know. And she saw what she recognizes now as a typical gray ET in the basement of the school. And what's really remarkable is there was also a craft. It was very, very small, like a tiny little sports compact car, just barely big enough to fit in the basement. It was very light, and she had an instant impression of how this thing actually operated, which was using some sort of electromagnetic engines. It's a very unusual case, but it starts to fit this pattern that I keep seeing over and over again, where these are not normal encounters. These are very, very close encounters, some involving abductions and missing time. There was another encounter which occurred in October 18th, 1967, at the Sunnyvale School, or in Sunnyvale, California. It's the Patrick Henry Junior High in Sunnyvale, California. Lynn Shannon, age 12, and about 50 other students saw 6 egg-like objects about 250 feet high come over the school here in California. They were very low, they were completely white, featureless, and freaked everyone out. The teachers freaked out and made everyone go inside. She was one of the last students to go inside, and as she did, she saw that one of these objects was coming lower and lower and lower and actually landed in the orchard behind the school. So after school was out, she went to the orchard to go see if it was still there, and that's all she remembers. The next thing she knows, it's 2 hours later, and she's arriving home, and she has no idea what happened during that missing time. This is Westmoreland High School in New York. This is another case which I have mentioned earlier in some of my presentations, involving a lady by the name of Shane Kurz. Back in 1967, she and her mother saw a UFO by their home and had a couple of sightings, and following that incident, she was coming into school and is about to enter into school when this gentleman approaches her, and he was a very strange-looking gentleman. He was very thin, he was wearing weird clothes. She can't quite remember what was weird about them other than that they were kind of futuristic or not in normal clothes. And he had strange hypnotic eyes that seemed to look right through her, pointy ears, very pale skin, and he started to ask her all these questions that really didn't make sense. He's like, what do you do here? And she's like, "Oh, we play volleyball and stuff." He's like, "Well, what's volleyball?" He did not know the answers to basic questions. And after questioning her for a few minutes, he asked if she would follow her to the field where his white car was parked there. It's a field, there's no road, and she wisely said no thank you, and turned around and was about to walk back into school when she realized that was really weird, turns right back around and the guy's gone. It's impossible, he could not have disappeared that quickly, there was no place for him to go, so that really freaked her out. And she's like, am I imagining things, what's going on? When a bunch of students approached her right after this incident and said, who is that weird looking guy you were talking to? And she's like, I have no idea. She saw him later at a convenience store, him or someone that looked just like him, and she later had an abduction experience and under hypnosis recalled seeing this same figure aboard the UFO. So yeah, they sometimes approach schools directly. This is the Nathaniel Hawthorne College in Antrim, New Hampshire. On April 30th, 1970, a group of boys who were at the school saw this huge triangular-shaped object moving overhead. They first thought it was just three lights, but as they saw that the sky was disappearing overhead, this was at night actually, they realized this is a very large triangular-shaped object, and they completely freaked out. This was right in front of the school, because the day before, a bunch of ladies in the women's dorm claimed that a UFO had arrived the day before this and actually landed on the lawn, but nobody believed them. So following this incident, they were of course believed, and again, it's another case where these objects specifically track schools. Police did come and interview the people, and it did create quite a bit of publicity at the time, but faded into history. This is Public Elementary School number 54 in Bronx, New York. In May 1970, 50 or 100 students or more watched a silver pyramidal-shaped object about the size of a school bus hover 100 feet overhead. And it was seen by the vice principal, the teachers, and much of the school staff. This is Richmond Elementary School in New Zealand. These cases occur all over the world. On May 17th, 1970, there was 400 kids out in the field playing when suddenly the teachers noticed the kids were not playing anymore. There was no sound. He's looking around and all the kids are staring up into the sky. And there is this giant kind of like hole in the sky. It's covering about half the sky. It's black, and it comes closer, and they realize, no, it's not a hole, it's some sort of giant wingless object. There was an airport nearby, and planes were landing and taking off, and not apparently seeing this thing. No one else saw it except for these people at this school, 400 students, and it stayed there for a good 10-15 minutes before just taking off and moving away. This is Foxcroft Boarding School in Middleburg, Virginia. A woman and 50 other young students saw this craft moving overhead at a very low level. This was again during the day. It floated downward closer and closer and closer till it was just a few hundred feet overhead. And as it reached right over the students, a door opened, or some sort of opening came out, and a big bright beam of light came down, and all the students jumped up and like, it's a flying saucer, and they started running after it, saying, take me with you, take me with you. There was no fear involved with this incident. They thought it was amazing, they loved it, and this thing just slowly kind of meandered off and took off. And now I want to take a quick break because I'm just over halfway through, and we're going to get to some really exciting stuff at this point involving some of the ET encounters, and talk about the Ruwa, Zimbabwe case and a few others. Now let's get to some really interesting cases. They just get more and more interesting. I'm just fascinated by these cases for a very personal reason, because someone within my family had a very close encounter at a school. The next case I would like to talk about is the Rosemead School. Began when 2 police officers driving by the school noticed lights in the school tennis court, which is completely fenced off There's a gate. The gate is locked. And they saw what looked like 2 cars or bikes driving around, circling and circling, but there were no headlights, just red taillight type things, but there was no noise. It was very peculiar, and lasted for just a few moments before these things took off. And nearby, 2 guards of the local petrol station there also saw these weird lights hovering over a nearby hill. The principal to the school lives right next door. He looked out of his window and saw these beams of light coming down and hitting the tennis courts. And he actually got up and went out, and the beams of light were gone, but he walked up to the tennis courts and he saw that a bunch of the asphalt had been torn up. So the next morning he went directly there and inspected it, and sure enough, the tennis courts were destroyed. And it was very strange because they were fine when he went to bed that night. And now they were just completely torn up in a very peculiar way, because the fence was fine. It wasn't torn up at all. The gate was still locked. And he's looking at the ground there where it's all torn up, and every single piece of tar was not flipped over at all. It was all just kind of broken up and laying there. There was a big piece of it on the fence. They called the police. The police did an investigation, and they found some pieces of this tennis court on a hill some distance away. So they brought in a lot of people to take a look at this thing, and no one could figure out what happened. The one scientist was like, well, it must have been a tornado, and which it clearly wasn't. But they did find some damage to the tree right next to the tennis court, a blue gum tree. Had all the green sprouts at the base of the trunk were all withered and burnt off, and it had lost a bunch of trees, and the tree just kind of withered away following this incident. So it's hard to say exactly what happened here, but it looks as though a UFO of some kind landed right there on the tennis courts, the school tennis courts in Rosemead, South Africa. This is the Cullahee University in North Carolina. On December 1st, 1974, on the 7th floor of the girls' dorm, a bunch of people became very startled when the entire dorm area lit up with a brilliant white light. It was so brilliant it actually lit up the entire interior of the girls' dorm, at least on the 7th floor. And they went rushing out and saw these bright, bright lights pretty high in the sky. There was 10 people at least who saw this. And they're watching this object in the sky, and it lifted up, and it started releasing about 5 orbs, which darted around in various ways and then took off. And they, of course, ran to the security of the school, who did not believe them. All right, I'm not sure if this is actually Falls Elementary School. It's as close as I could get. All these other slides are the actual schools where they did happen. I'm not entirely sure about this one, but this took place in Green Valley, California, in the mid to late 1970s. A lady I'll call Linda went to this school throughout her childhood and started having some weird memories as she grew up. She started having memories of playing with a gray alien while at school. And at first she kept seeing it as a child, but she started to see through its disguise, and that it was in fact a gray E.T. And it kept asking her all these weird questions and telling her all this stuff she didn't understand, and kept asking her to go into the grove behind the school, which she refused to do. But apparently some kids did go, because she started having memories of people being taken by ETs into this grove. And this caused a ruckus at the school. There was some children who were injured or had some sort of traumatic incident in the grove, and they ended up closing this grove down. But she says she had repeated encounters over a period of 5 years at least, and she feels like a lot of the students in this school were probably abducted, and she's still grappling with this as an adult. Now, this is a map of Broadhaven Primary School. This is in Wales. In 1977, there was a wave of sightings over Wales, and at least 3 schools were targeted. 2 of the schools had very low-level encounters where these objects hovered over the school right down to not only tree level, but within the trees, as if coming in for a landing. And those cases were not publicized really at all. It was the Broadhaven incident on February 1977, where more than a dozen students saw this object actually land right next to the school. It was about a 40-foot long object with a red light on top. They saw a door opened up in the center of the craft, and a figure emerged. And at this point, these were, elementary school kids. They became very frightened, some of them. They began crying, and they ran as a group away from this object and the ET straight to the teachers, who did not believe them. And the teachers went outside. The UFO was gone by this time. It turned out one of the teachers did, in fact, see the object depart, but she decided not to tell anyone because she was the only one who saw it, and she didn't want to be ridiculed. Later, she did reveal to investigators that she did, in fact, see this craft fly over the school. The children certainly insist that they saw it and would not be swayed. So what the teachers did is separated them and had them draw pictures of what they saw. And it's really interesting because these drawings show really closely what they saw and have some really remarkable similarities. So these students didn't get any messages from the ET. They left pretty much before it actually approached closely to them. But they were within, 20, 30 feet of this strange figure. And here are some of their drawings, and you'll see that they're remarkably similar. Most of them describe this sort of dome-shaped object which landed in the trees. Not all of them actually saw the actual ET figure. Some were too frightened to look. Others just didn't see it. But you can see that their drawings are really, really similar. See the antenna coming out up on the upper right there. That appears in another child's drawing. You see the door in the center there on the right there, and also on the lower drawing. Here's another close-up. In each of these cases, they're landing right within a grove of trees. I find that really interesting. I love these child drawings, and again, I think these children make great witnesses. I can't tell you how many adults I've interviewed who saw UFOs as very young children. And that's generally a rule when someone has repeated contact, that it starts very early in childhood. And as a general rule, their parents don't believe them. So I think this is a really important type of encounter that we have to start paying closer attention to, because as a general rule, the teachers don't believe the students either until they realize that they're all crying and they're all reporting the same story and they're not backing up. So each of them drew pictures of what they saw, and you can see how remarkably similar they really are. The incident caused quite an uproar. Police were called, and the children all testified. They put their a little petition together asking for an investigation, which apparently never happened. And the government said, no, we never did one, but researchers later found out that the government was lying, and they did, in fact, do discrete inquiries into what happened here at Broadhaven. And at that time, it turned out there was a wave of sightings going on in the area. There were sightings before this day and after this day. But it was these students who saw these ETs, and to this day, they are traumatized by it. They're obsessed with the subject. They're continuing to investigate it, and this is a pattern we certainly see in other cases, that people come away from these encounters profoundly changed for the rest of their lives. So this is St. Mark's School, also in Glasgow, Scotland. In 1978, Ewan Riley was one of dozens of students who watched a silver metallic object hovering about 20 feet above the school. And they watched it for some time and went to go alert the teachers, at which point this thing took off very quickly. This is the North Carolina School for the Deaf. Very interesting case, which occurred in March 1979, where this object, this school is located in a low valley. This object was seen approaching the school directly towards it, coming down lower and lower and lower to the point where it was actually going to hit the school if it did not rise up. And it came right up to the school and lifted up and came over the school. And was making this very loud woo, 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 thrumming noise. Now the children were deaf in the school. They could still hear it. It was vibrating so loudly that they all heard it within their bodies and came running out to look at this thing. I'm wondering if this was something that ETs did intentionally or not. I don't know. But it was a very interesting case because they were able to actually hear this thing even though they're profoundly deaf. And this thing came so low, they were sure it was going to hit the building, comes over it and moves on. And wasn't long later that evening, after all the children had gone to bed, it returned and was seen by a bunch of people hovering between this building and the hospital next door. So this is a local case. This is one I mentioned earlier, which occurred to a family member. The first humanoid case I ever investigated. And her name is Melissa, and she was a college student at the time. She lived next to Stagg Street Elementary School and was taking a walk with her dog right in front of the school. This was around 11 p.m. in the evening here in Van Nuys, 5 miles away from here about. And this was around 1982. And as she's walking by the school, right in the front courtyard there is a large light. You can see it here right next to the sign, a floodlight. And she's like, well, that's strange. There's 2 children standing under the floodlight. This is, 11 o'clock at night. She's like, well, that's weird. What are they doing out at night? They look like they're only 3 or 4 feet tall. And as she's getting closer to them, she realizes they're bald. She's like, well, that's even weirder. She's like, they look like they're wearing masks. And she's thinking, well, it's not Halloween. What's going on? And she walks right up to them. And she's about 10 feet away. So is her dog. Her dog doesn't react really at all. And she turns and she looks at them, and they turn and look at her. And she says that they were actually like floating slightly off the ground, and they kind of like opening a book. They just swiveled, turned, and they locked gazes with her. And she said it was exactly like being woken up when you're already awake, because this was something she had never seen before. Back then, there wasn't a whole lot of talk about gray aliens. Certainly, she'd never heard of them. She's an artist. She's, a very great observer. She's got an eidetic memory. She can remember things of entire TV shows. She can recount word for word, practically. Amazing memory. And she's telling me all these details of these ETs that she saw right in front of the school. She said that they were very short. They had olive green jumpsuits with mandarin collars, very large heads with sort of a separation at the top of their skull. Their skin was chalk white. If they were humans, they would have been dead. It was just completely white skin and huge, dark, glistening eyes. And she was about 10 feet away from them when they locked gazes. She didn't hear any messages. She just got this real incredible thrill of fear and decided, you know what, I'm going to keep walking. She didn't want to run because she didn't want to panic. And so she just walked as quickly as she could back home. She says she had no missing time. She doesn't think she did. She didn't see any UFO, but she's like, Preston, this school could probably hide a UFO pretty darn easily because it had this sort of enclosed playground area, which was surrounded by buildings. And she speculates that maybe the object had actually landed inside the elementary school, which I wouldn't discount. It's entirely possible. But yeah, that was my first humanoid case, and it was right here locally and involved ETs at an elementary school. Most of these cases where schools are targeted are, in fact, elementary schools, which I find interesting, but they also include middle schools, primary schools, high schools, and colleges. And this is unusual. I mean, we don't see this where adults are gathering, at their work, their factory, or office buildings, or restaurants, or any other sort of thing. So there's something about schools, which I think it's the children, actually, which is attracting these ETs. This is Adams Middle School in Grand Prairie, Texas. In October of 1982, Allison and dozens of other students, teachers, and administration officials had just ended a school dance and were in front of the school waiting to get picked up and leave the area when these multicolored orbed lights started darting around a much larger oval object. They were putting on what was clearly a display. They were moving at right angles, forming triangles, squares, and various geometric shapes. They came so low that at one point she could feel the static electricity clinging to her dress and her hair, and a number of people reported on this very strong static electric feeling. She worked as an office assistant in the school, and the next day she was in the office when the Air Force showed up and started making discreet inquiries about what happened, and had the principal make an announcement that day that what the people saw last night was nothing, was just a light show. Well, she was a very inquisitive person and started doing an investigation. She's now an intelligence officer within the U.S. military. And she searched everywhere for any sort of light show, people who put on light shows, any sort of explanation, and she could find no one or no information about what this might have been. So there are a lot of other cases. There was one case in May 1991 where I don't know the location of it, but a bunch of people were on the school playground when they saw what looked like a round rainbow in the sky getting lower and lower and lower. And this kid was staring at it, and normally he likes to be first in line and get into the class. Next thing he knows, some time has passed, and he's last in line, and he doesn't understand it, and everyone's looking at him really strangely, and he doesn't know why. And following this incident, he had these dreams where he was taken on board a UFO. He saw a bunch of the other students from the playground there, and they were being given various tests on how to do telekinesis with objects. They were told to take a box and change its shape, find which direction it should be moved. And the answer was to be moved inside out. So he finally figured it out, and they took him to the next room and did another mental test where they threw these fiery, like, brands or sticks right at him. His hands were bound behind his back in some way, and he had to move these sticks mentally. And so he saw other students doing this. This was pretty traumatic, and he did not feel good about the entire experience. But it's another example of where I think these aren't just sightings or landings or face-to-face encounters, but actual onboard incidents. And now I want to talk about really the main case that I came here to talk about, which is the Ruwa, Zimbabwe case at Ariel Elementary School, which occurred in 1994. There's a film coming out called The Ariel Phenomena, which I believe is being released this year. I can't wait to see it because this incident has received a lot of media attention, but has never really been fully explored. Occurred some years ago, and a lot of the witnesses today are still talking about it. And what happened was about 50 or 40 students were on the playground and saw this thing. Some didn't see it, this object, which came and landed right next to the school within a grove of trees. A bunch of people ran up to it, and two entities came out. And they were described as having a black uniform or being dark in color, and having, some said they were bald, others said no, they had long dark hair, looked like a hippie. So you get some varying descriptions there. Some were very frightened, others weren't. And some of the people came right up to these ETs, and the ETs came up to them and started delivering telepathic messages to the students. And the messages were pretty much uniform. For each student, it was the same sort of message, which was about the future of our planet, the environmental destruction that is going on. And they warned people about pollution. They warned people about technological problems, misusing technology, and this sort of thing. Forests and basically environmental messages. Here's the actual playground where this incident occurred. Here are some of the school children who saw this thing. This is Emily Trim. She is a very outspoken witness who has talked quite a bit about this. It affected her deeply. She was one of the ones who received a message. Not all students did. There was about 5 or 10 who did, and she was certainly one of them. And she, as several of the other students who had this experience, following this experience, began having visitations at home and throughout their life, became abductees, apparently as a result of this visitation. So this has had a profound effect on their lives in multiple ways. And I want to show you some of the drawings of what they saw, because they're just amazing. This is one of my favorite things about schoolyard encounters, is all these drawings that have come out of them. And you can see that they're very similar in each of these cases. They draw these craft that are dome-shaped, have windows, a dome on top, and some saw, always within these grove of trees. Some saw entities walking around it. Some described one of the entities walking on top of the craft, and came right up to the students in a number of cases. They seemed to float a little bit. Some of the students were very frightened and said that they looked like they had evil eyes. Others were just completely entranced by the entire incident. And none of the teachers saw this. None of the teachers saw anything, apparently. And following the incident, they went running back to the teachers in a group, screaming like, "We just saw this, we just saw this," and they're describing what happened. And as with other incidents, the teachers separated them and had them draw what they had seen. And they all told substantially the same story and drew these various pictures that you're seeing here of this object that had landed in the trees. And you can see here the entity right on top of the craft up there. And so yeah, it's a very interesting case. It's still being fully explored, and it looks like these ETs came specifically to deliver messages. And I think this is what's happening here. They are coming to schools because they know that children are open-minded. They learn very quickly. They're kind of vulnerable in a way that allows them to soak up knowledge in a way where adults aren't as easily influenced or impressed, I guess would be the better word of saying it, on these various ideas that are trying to get across. So yeah, some amazing drawings of all these craft and ETs that they saw, and I do want to play, for the closing part of this lecture, a little slide, or I mean not a slide, a little 5-minute segment of the witnesses speaking about what they saw. So let's just see if I can get this set up real quick.
In September 1994, over 60 children from this school in the suburbs of Harare, Zimbabwe, witnessed several objects landing and 2 beings coming out. Just over 2 months later, John and Dominique came to the scene to work with the children, their parents, and the teachers still suffering from shock. John, who essentially specialized in child psychiatry, devoted a great deal of time to interviewing the children.
Something scared you, is that right?
Yes.
What scared you?
The noise.
What noise?
The noise that we heard in the air.
You heard a noise in the
Yes.
air? What was it like? Like a roar or a buzz or a hum, or what kind of a noise?
It was like someone was blowing a flute. It was scary myself.
It was scary because you saw something yourself?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I saw little objects hovering. It was quite big actually, and then there was little ones all around it.
We saw something silver, and then we quickly ran to the logs, and we saw a silver thing, and we saw a man standing next to it.
What did it feel like when he was looking at you?
I felt scared.
It felt scared? What was scary about it?
Well, I felt scared because I've never seen such a person like that before.
Did you see the eyes? What did they look like?
They were going like that.
Where was the pointy part? Was the pointy part in here, or was the pointy part out there? Up there. And what was the feeling when you looked at the eyes?
It was scary.
Mm-hmm. And what, scary, why? What made it scary?
The eyes looked evil.
Evil. And what was evil about them? Say what you mean by evil.
It looked evil because it was just staring at me.
With what? Staring at you as if what? As if to do what?
As if it wanted to come and take us.
As if it wanted to come and take you. That was the feeling you got? That it wanted you to go with it? Did you feel like you wanted to go with it? No. Did you feel, what was the effect on you when you felt it wanted to have you go with it?
I just walked away and I started crying.
They came running up here in such a panic. And I mean, even if we had staged it, they could not have run all together like that. Even if we practiced it, I don't know how many times. That they came up here like a living snake. And they just came, we were in a staff meeting and we just heard them screaming, ah, and then they were here, you know, and a child can't make that up.
I was very skeptical in the beginning as well. I believed that they'd seen something, but I wasn't prepared to accept that it was anything supernatural or anything like that. But I think the consistency of what's been going on indicates that it was more than I was prepared to admit in the beginning.
So both of them were running. One was running in the trees, and the other one was running across the ship, because there were also trees here.
The eyes were like more pointed as they came in toward the center of the head, is that?
No, more circular. And this was all black in here.
All black. Now you've made pupils. Did they actually have pupils or black?
White.
What?
The pupils were white like that.
You saw white in the center?
Yes, like that.
Was he near the silver object, or was he far from
No,
it?
on top.
On top of the silver object. Okay. And did you look at him?
Yes.
Did he look at you?
Yes, then he gave me the creeps, then I stopped looking
Gave you
at
the
him.
creeps. Actually, in your drawing, you showed him standing up, didn't you?
Yes, I had to draw him standing up because I couldn't draw him sitting. What I thought was maybe the world's going to end. Maybe they're telling us the world's going to end.
Why do you think they might want us to be scared?
Because because we don't look after the planet, the area properly.
And is this an idea that you have had before, that we don't look after the planet properly in the air, or did this idea come to you when you had this experience?
When I had this experience.
And how did that idea come to you from this experience? This is a little hard, but try to be with me here, okay? How did this idea come to you when you had this experience?
I just felt all horrible inside.
You felt horrible. At what point did you feel that? When you saw the craft, or when you got home at night? Or
When I got home.
You had that horrible feeling when you got home?
Yes.
And say more about that horrible feeling, Lisa. What was it like?
It was like the world, all the trees will just go down and there will be no air and people will be dying.
And those thoughts came to you, had you had those thoughts before this experience?
No.
No. And how did those thoughts come to you? Did they come to you from the craft or from...
From the man.
The man. And did the man say those things to you? How did he get that across to you?
Well, he never said anything. It's just that the face is the eyes.
What was the sense you got from those eyes?
He was interested.
They describe these experiences or these events like a person talks about something that has happened to them. And When you're talking with a psychotic who's telling you something and it's a delusion and you feel that it really didn't happen, I can tell. I mean, I know this is something that person wants me to believe, or they're frightened, or they're distorting reality in some way. There's nothing like that here. These are people of sound mind, by and large, telling me something that's very... They know that I might think they're crazy, and so they're a little concerned about telling me, and they're very full of questioning themselves and doubt, and I mean, and then they describe something very real and intense, a light or something happened to their body, or it's the whole quality of the way they talk about it is the way a person talks about experience that happened to them.
All of a sudden, it was just like imaging going through my head of a message. A communication. I describe it as, I guess, a telepathic communication. There was no talking.
I remember being very captivated by the eyes, and in that moment, however long it was, because I have no idea of the time frame, it was mesmerizing. It was absolutely captivating.
As soon as I saw it, I knew that this was something from another planet or something from out of this worldly space.
People need to know there is something else out there.
So yeah, pretty amazing stuff. What I think the takeaway from these schoolyard UFO encounters is that yes, UFOs are targeting our schools. I think there's no doubt about it. These are very extensive encounters. I think the ones I've presented here, the ones I've collected, probably just the tip of the iceberg. I know there's 4 or 5 major cases. I found 40 or 50. I'm guessing there's probably several hundred that we haven't heard about. And hopefully that we will become more aware of this, and next time children come running in from the schoolyard and saying that there's a UFO landed on the playground, we don't laugh at them, and we go out and we check and look. And because these encounters are affecting these children still to this day, and I think that's the purpose. This is why ETs are doing it. They're influencing people, catching them while they're young and impressionable, and getting these ideas across. The number one message when someone is taken on board a craft, the most common thing that happens is being physically examined. But if the ETs do talk to a person, they give messages, and they generally fall into 3 categories. One is about alternative energy. They'll take people to the engine room and show them how it works. They will give messages about healing or spirituality, channeling past lives, out-of-body experiences, hands-on healing, this sort of thing. Psychic development. But aside from that, the single most common message that people receive is what exactly these children here at Ruwa, Zimbabwe are saying. Messages about the environmental destruction of our planet. They seem to be very intent on getting this message across to people. And if the adults aren't going to listen, maybe the children will. And so this is definitely something that they're doing very regularly all over the planet, all across the United States. I've got cases in Canada, England, Wales, France, several in South America, Africa, Australia, Russia. Found a bunch of cases just yesterday in China, which I didn't have time to stick into here. But yeah, it's a worldwide phenomena. And I'm not worried about it. I don't think there's anything nefarious about this. I think they're just trying to get the message across to people while they're young that it's important that we take care of our planet. And I think that's what their real agenda is for hovering over schools. I'm speculating here, but this is what the messages that are coming across from the students. So yeah, next time your kid comes running in and says they've seen a UFO while they were at school, as incredible as it might sound, this is definitely a thing that's happening all over our planet.
Preston, thanks so much for a great presentation.
Hey, thank you.